Well, tonight as we look at Joseph's burial, it's going to be a little bit before we actually get there. We have other things to do. The burial actually comes at the very end of our study. But I want to give a little bit of review and just kind of walk through the 6 weeks that we've been together for a few minutes, and then we'll dig into this 50th chapter and finish out our study. All the way back to the beginning of our study, as we just kind of park on this review panel here on our screen, and you're going to see some bullet points coming down through there, and you don't have to jot this down unless you just want to. But you remember our first night together, we talked about Joseph's birth and his boyhood. And in that particular study, we talked about his dad, Jacob. We talked about his mom, Rachel. We talked about his brothers, his sister, and the whole environment in which he grew up in, and what an environment that must have been. Every now and then as a counselor, I have folks that come to me and they are in a blended family situation. And it's always a little bit difficult for me to fully relate to what they're going through, because I wasn't brought up in a blended family, but as much as I try as a counselor, I try to relate to folks that are going through some of the difficulties of blending. But I tell you, when I think about Joseph, I don't know if too many blended families are quite like what he grew up in, with stepmoms and stepbrothers and a sister being raped, and there's just a lot of different things going on in his life. And so if you are seeking to help somebody in a blended family, maybe the life of Joseph might help them. Then on our second night together, we talked about Joseph's betrayal. And if you remember on that night, we studied about the time in which Joseph was given this coat of many colors. And you remember that we talked about that when I was in Sunday school growing up, and probably when you were in Sunday school growing up, the coat of many colors of Joseph was always lifted up and exalted as this great, magnificent, neat thing. But yet we learned in our study that it became a real badge of trouble for Joseph. Not only because of what it said, but because his dad evidently didn't give me any instructions as far as when to wear it and when not to wear it. And so just like an excited teenager, as we are excited when we get Christmas and birthday gifts, when Joseph was given this coat, man, he puts it on. And he goes out there and wears it in front of these brothers. And they don't like it at all. Because it says to the brothers, Dad likes me best. I'm in the chosen position. I am going to be the principal heir, and he loves me more than he loves you. And those brothers didn't like it one bit. And when Jacob sent Joseph to go look for the brothers in Shechem, and he finds them in Dothan, they conspired to kill him. And again, as we were reminded in that study, that's not the Bible just being over dramatic, because two of these guys had already committed murder. And so they really wanted him dead. Well, in the process of time, they were talked out of actually committing murder, and you remember he was thrown into a pit, sold to some Ishmaelites, some Midianite traders. He eventually became the property of Potiphar, and we studied all about his betrayal in that situation on that second night together. On our third night together, we talked about Joseph's battle and his bondage, kind of a two-part study on that night. The first part of week number 3 was a battle with Miss Potiphar. By now, Joseph is a very handsome, muscular, maybe even Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of guy. And when Miss Potiphar saw him, she fell in love with him. Or at least she fell infatuated with him, and she wanted to be with him in a very personal way. Well, years before this, Joseph had already committed his life to God, that he's going to live a life of purity, a life of dedication to God, and so he has no interest in what she has in mind. Well, when she is spurned, when she is shunned, she accuses him of something he did not do, and when Potiphar came home, Miss Potiphar tells him her version of what Joseph did, and Potiphar throws him in prison, and that takes us to the bondage situation. Now, while he's there in prison, in bondage, you'll remember that the baker and the butler, two guys who served the Pharaoh, messed up. They fell in disfavor with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh throws them in prison. Well, by now, Joseph is a kind of a leader trustee in the prison. Trustee meaning he's a trusted one. He's one that the master of the prison saw that he could be trusted, and so he put him in charge of the prison. And when the baker and the butler come down there, they fall into being under the leadership of Joseph. Well, these two guys have dreams about their future. And you remember, things didn't turn out so well for the baker. His dream wasn't very exciting. But the butler was told he was going to be returned to his butlership, and he was going to have a chance to put the cup in Pharaoh's hand again. And you remember Joseph said to the butler, when you get out of here, put in a good word for me. But the Bible tells us the butler forgot Joseph. And for 2 more years, he was in that prison situation. Probably for the first week or two, month or two, he was expecting those prison doors to swing open and somebody from Pharaoh's court to come down and get him out of there. But it didn't happen. And day after day, week after week, month after month, for 2 years, he remained in that prison. Well, as you also know then, in week 4, we got to Joseph's blessing. And on the blessing night, we remember that Pharaoh had a couple of dreams, and once again, as God worked in the life of Joseph, God gave Joseph the ability to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh about the 7 years of feast and the 7 years of famine. And because everything, as Joseph is interpreting these dreams for the Pharaoh, it's like the lights are just coming on. The Pharaoh, I can see it now. And by the end of his interpretation, Pharaoh is so excited, he elevates him to number 2 in the nation. Gives him a very powerful position. Also in that blessing study, remember that Joseph marries a lady by the name of Asenath, and they are given 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Actually, Manasseh first and then Ephraim, but because later on we've learned that we typically refer to them as Ephraim and Manasseh. In week 5, we talked about Joseph's brothers. A first of 2 parts, 2 weeks on Joseph's brothers. And on that 5th night together, you remember that the brothers come down to Egypt looking for food because now the famine is well on the way and they're needing food. And as they come down to get food from Joseph, they don't know that it's Joseph. Joseph now has aged, and he's talking roughly with them and talks with them through an interpreter. And they don't recognize him as Joseph, but they recognize him as a very powerful individual. And in the process here of that 5th night together, Joseph has some fun with the brothers as God uses him to teach some lessons to these brothers. On part 2, in our 6th night together last Sunday night, we actually then studied about how the brothers came down to Egypt. They set up in the land of Goshen. And if you will come now to Genesis chapter 49 and verse 33, that's where we ended last Sunday night, where we talked about after Jacob gave his last will and testament to the brothers and to his sons about what was going to happen to them in the future. It says there in Genesis 49:33, and when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So Jacob now has passed away. Well, there's more to the story here in chapter 50, and that takes us into point number 1 of our outline tonight, Jacob's death. Jacob's death. And letter A there is Joseph's mourning. Look at verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Now, several weeks ago and several chapters ago, back in about chapter 46, we studied about how God told Jacob when he stopped off at Beersheba. Remember when he's there at Beersheba, he checks in with God to make sure it's going to be okay for him to go down to Egypt. God tells Jacob to not fear about going down to see Joseph because he's going to put his hand on your eyes. And that is a customary way of saying, Jacob, you're going to be there when you die. And Joseph's going to be right there. Well, that moment has arrived. And it was the customary plan and customary thing to do for the closest of kin, the eldest, to put the hands on the eyes of the deceased and give them a parting kiss. And that's what we see right here. Then Joseph fell on his father's face, wept over him, and kissed him. Well, even though it was the customary thing to do, it was very difficult to do. Even when we know that someone is approaching the years of death and approaching the moment of death, when the death actually happens, it's a very difficult thing. It's a very heart-wrenching. At one point, as believers, if this person that's passing is a believer, we can rejoice that they're now out of their misery and they're in the presence of the Lord. But there's also that sign of that sense of loss and separation. Please don't let anybody, especially the enemy, please don't let anybody ever convince you that it's weak faith to mourn that somebody's passing. There's praise and there's glory that they're with God, but it's a normal, personal reaction when we mourn someone's passing. And as Joseph is there, this great statesman, this great man of faith, this great man of God, when he sees his father has passed away, he mourns over him and kisses him. Well, next we see here Joseph's instructions. Look at verse 2. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel, or embalmed Jacob. Now, in ancient Egypt, the art of embalming people really was an art, it was a science, but it was a work in progress. We've learned, and currently morticians have learned a lot from the Egyptians as far as how they embalmed bodies, how they cared for the body. I'm going to spare you all the details of what they did. If you want to read about the embalming process, there is a plethora of information out there. You can just read until your heart is content about all that they did. I'm just going to stop right there. But you can read about that, and it was a lengthy process of all that they did. But let me share this. It was elaborate. It was detailed. It was thorough. It was an art and a science, and it was done by professionals. When the text here says, and Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, what we find here is there was a special guild of professionals that this was their ministry, this was their work. This is what they were trained and skilled to do. And so as they did this, they took it very seriously, and it was a profession for them. That takes us to verse 3. Notice, 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. 40 days. Now, the embalming process of the Egyptians was a work in progress, because it doesn't take 40 days anymore. In our day, and with technology, with different kinds of chemicals and skills and tools and whatever, it doesn't take that long. But in those days, it did take that long, and then they mourned for him for 70 days, and that takes us to letter C here, and some national mourning. Notice it says, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Now the marker here is interesting. This 70-day national mourning by the Egyptians is significant because they mourned for the death of a Pharaoh 72 days. So it was customary when a Pharaoh would pass away, when he would breathe his last, that the nation would go into a specific 72 days of mourning. I don't really know how they came up with 72 days, but that's what it was. So for Jacob to be mourned for 70 days was a tremendous show of respect for Jacob, but probably even more so for Joseph. Because this is Joseph's dad, and the Egyptians now enter into this 70-day mourning period, and they remembered him very specifically. That takes us now to point 2 in our study guide, and Jacob's burial. Jacob's burial. So they've embalmed him. Possibly they've put him in a coffin. It doesn't tell us that. He would certainly probably have been mummified. He would have been cared for in that way. But he was then mourned for a total of 70 days. And that takes us then to point 2, Jacob's burial. And first of all, letter A there, the expected request. Now when the days of his mourning, verse 4, now when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. Now this expected request, it would have been expected. The Pharaoh was expecting Joseph to come and make this kind of request. It's interesting to me, maybe interesting to you, and maybe noteworthy. Why would there be such this specific kind of request? If the Pharaoh was expecting it, why would Joseph have to go to great lengths and make this appeal? It would almost be automatic. Pharaoh would have thought, well, Jacob's passed, okay, he's got to do this. I think we continue to see Joseph in his respect for his leader. He's not going to do anything. He's not going to be presumptuous at any hand. And he's going to make this appeal to the Pharaoh to be able to depart and go and bury his father. But it is also interesting here, as you read the verbiage here, as you read the grammar, Joseph didn't actually go to the Pharaoh and made this request. He used an emissary. He used a go-between. Somebody made this request to the Pharaoh for Joseph in Joseph's behalf. And my question, why? If Joseph and the Pharaoh were this close, why would there need to be this emissary? A couple of different options might be. One is, of course, during the life of Joseph, pharaohs would have come and gone. There would have been different pharaohs, and he may not have been as close to one as close to the other. But also, and probably the more important issue, is when Joseph now has been in this period of mourning for his dad, it would have been customary for him to let his beard grow, for him not to care for himself and not put on his number 2 prime minister in the world tuxedo every day, and he would just kind of be relaxing and reminiscing and thinking about his dad and all the years he wasn't with his dad, now the years he's been with his dad, and there's a lot of things going on here. And if you remember all the way back to our study, when Joseph's down there in prison, and it's learned, it comes to the Pharaoh's hearing that there's a man in his prison who's able to interpret dreams, and of course Joseph is that one. And they come down to get Joseph out of the prison. What's the first thing that they do? He shaves. He cleans himself up and makes himself presentable to the Pharaoh. For Joseph to just walked up to the Pharaoh with beard out and with just his kind of his weekend clothes on, it would have been a show of disrespect. And Joseph's not going to do that. He's not going to take anything for granted. And so in a show of respect and recognize the Egyptian culture and recognizing the position of the Pharaoh, he sends somebody in his place to go there. And you see that. Let's read verse 4 again. Now when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh. So the idea there is, I want you to go speak to Pharaoh for me. And that's the way the wording is put here. That takes us into letter B and the great procession. The great procession. There is going to be a tremendous procession of people. They're going to go with Joseph to bury Jacob. Look at verse 7. So Joseph went up to bury his father And with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks, and their herds, they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with them both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. Now let's look down through here, and let's think about this great procession. First of all, of course, there would have been Joseph. Joseph was leading the charge. Whether Joseph was riding in his chariot or whether Joseph was being carted there in an Egyptian limousine, he was out there, he was leading the charge. Second, there would have been the servants of Pharaoh. The servants of Pharaoh would be, just as you think about that, would be the people who served Pharaoh. It might be too strong to say the slaves of Pharaoh, because the word slave has a whole lot of baggage associated with it. But they were those who served Pharaoh, cared for Pharaoh, and did the different things, his bidding. Thirdly, there are the elders of the house of Pharaoh. Now this word elders here has several different understandings. It refers to the older people, but it also is probably more specifically defined as the statesmen, what we might think as the senators, the district managers, the district leaders, the significant leadership of the house of Pharaoh. And we also have the elders of Egypt. Again, the same kind of idea. Some of the elder statesmen, some of the dignitaries would have traveled with Joseph on this great procession of people. Then, of course, there is the family of Joseph: Asenath, Ephraim, Manasseh, the older grandchildren and great-grandchildren, those old enough to travel, because we've already read that the little ones, the young ones, didn't go. Then there's all these brothers of Joseph. They went. And then the household of Jacob. Now the distance that they traveled was 300 miles. Now think about that. 300 miles. That's the great procession that they're going to travel from the land of Goshen up to the place we're going to read about here in just a minute, to the threshing floor at Atad. And then some of them are going to go on to the cave in Machpelah. So that's where we're headed. Large, stately, elaborate funeral processions were well known in the Egyptian culture. Now think about how things are today. When there's a funeral procession in our day, it's maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Typically, in my experience as a pastor, when there has been a procession that is past an hour or an hour and a half, 2 hours, usually they just say, meet us there. We're not going to travel up the highway. We're not going to travel Highway 55 and 57. We're not going to go to Chicago at 45 miles an hour. Or 25. Or just meet us there. And if you need directions, here's where we're going. You plug it into your GPS and be there at 2:30 or 4 o'clock or whatever, and then we'll have the graveside service. Well, they all traveled together 300 miles. As I thought about that, I thought about this great throng of people. All these, this would have been something like a presidential procession, like a head of state dying. It was an elaborate deal. Think of all the food that they would have needed. The water. They could have, probably picked up food and water along the way, but it's not quite like in our day. There's no guarantee there's going to be a rest stop, over the next mountainside. Changes of clothing, just all the different things they would have needed to have made this trip. And so it was a very elaborate situation of taking the body of Jacob to its final resting place. That takes us into letter C and the stop at Atad. Verse 10. Then they came to the threshing floor at Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, would be on the east side of the Jordan. If you can think about Israel, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, east side of that. And they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father. Now let's talk about this threshing floor for a minute. The idea of a threshing floor might put a lot of different images in your mind that could be incorrect. A threshing floor did not have any walls. It did not have a building. It wasn't a lean-to shed. It might have become that later on. But a threshing floor, for those of you who are golfers, it would be like a 50 to 100 feet diameter golf green without any grass. It would have been elevated from the surrounding terrain, and so there is this 50 to 100 feet in diameter plot of ground that was brown, clean, dry, and hard as a rock. That's a threshing floor. Now the reason why it was called that, it was where they would thresh the wheat. They would take those heads of grain and they would beat them on that floor. If you've ever been to China, you've probably seen ladies at a threshing floor threshing rice and harvesting the rice. And they would take that and they would beat it on that threshing floor, on that hard plot of ground, and then they would sweep it up and they would harvest it. Well, this threshing floor, this 50 to 100 feet in diameter floor, solid as a rock, hard, brown, clean, made for a great place for an outdoor gathering. And there at Atad, at this threshing floor, they chose that as another place of mourning. Notice what it says there. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father, and there was a great and solemn lamentation there at this threshing floor. Look what it says in verse 11. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians." Therefore its name was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan. And so there they mourned for him another 7 days. A time of rest, a time again to just recollect their thoughts about the life of Jacob and all that he lived. That takes us letter D there in the completion of the trip. Look at verses 12 and 13. So his sons did for him just as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as property for a burial place. Now the verbiage here, the way this is put together, leads most, if not all, scholars to believe that the Egyptians stayed on the east side there at Atad. And only Joseph and Joseph's brothers and the family went on to the cave of Machpelah. As you think about that, in our culture, it's very customary to have funeral services that are open to the public, that anybody and everybody can come. And then maybe it happens in your family, however you all choose to do that, it's your choice. Maybe you have a graveside service where it's just the immediate family. And that's pretty customary, it's pretty common. And that seems to be what was going on here. And it makes us wonder, do we get a lot of our funeral understandings and practices from the Egyptians and from the Israelites and how they cared for things? Well, it appears as though then the Egyptians stay there at Atad while Joseph and the rest of the family move on, and they do what they need to do. They bury Jacob. They perform what they were required to do, what Jacob asked them to do. They fulfill the commitment. And then verse 14 takes us to the return to Egypt. The return to Egypt. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt. That's what he promised the Pharaoh he would do. So he's returning now. He and his brothers and all who went up with him to bury his father. So evidently they left Machpelah, the cave there. They went back to Atad. They pick up the rest of the group and they travel back down the land of Goshen. And of course, we also know there's the land of Ramses. And then Pharaoh and all his guys, all his troop, they go back home. That takes us to letter number 3 here. Point number 3, and Joseph's brothers. Now we're still moving toward Joseph's burial. Obviously we haven't made it there yet, but that's where we're headed. But point number 3 here, Joseph's brothers. And look at verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, in other words, all this is kind of, it's not like they didn't understand it beforehand, but the reality is all coming now fresh in their heart. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. And so they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Let's think of these 3 things here in Joseph's brothers. First of all, notice their fear. Their fear. Verse 15. They were afraid, and those of you that are Godfather fans, now that the Godfather's dead, they're afraid Joseph is going to get even. They're fearful. Letter B there is their request. Verses 16 and 17. And they send a delegation of people. They send a spokesman to Joseph to talk to him, to remind him what his dad promised or what his dad commanded him to do to forgive his brothers. And they go to him and they ask him to make good on his promise. And we've already read there, and Joseph wept. Gang, I want to tell you, an arrow in the back, a dagger in the heart would not have hurt as much as this question, as much as these words from these boys. Think about all that Joseph did for them. When they treated him the worst, he gave them the best. When he cared for them, when he set them up in the land of Goshen, gave them the best possible place to live, cared for them, watched over and protected them. And yet they have the nerve to say these things. That takes us to letter C here and their problem. What is their problem? What would lead them to say these kinds of things to Joseph? 3 things you might want to jot down. First of all, they knew the power of Joseph. They knew that Joseph had the power to have them exterminated. He's the number 2 man. He's the prime minister, you might say, of the nation of Egypt, and he has the power to wield against these guys, and if he wants to, he can do this. As I think about how these thoughts kind of came to their mind, I don't know how it is for you, but when you travel, your mind can think about a lot of different things. You know, you're there in the car, you got the cruise control locked in at 70. You wouldn't dare go 75 and a 70, or you got it locked in, and you're just driving. Boy, your mind can just think of so many things. Pat and I, when we travel, we seem to travel a lot between here and Jackson, Tennessee, and then we kind of go north. That's kind of our track to Indiana. And it seems like every time we take that journey from here, get on Interstate 40 and heading toward Jackson, it seems like almost every time there's an accident somewhere in that stretch. I don't know if it's because it's so straight and flat and there's just not a whole lot of exciting things going on between here and that area, that people just, maybe they get to thinking about other things and they just drift off the highway. I don't know what it might be. Maybe they're going too fast. Maybe it's the truck. I don't know. But I want to tell you, when these guys are traveling, that 300-mile trip back from Atad, from the cave of Machpelah, that travel, they get to thinking, I wonder what's going to happen to us when we get back home. They feared the power of Joseph. Second, I think another one of their problems, they didn't know the heart of Joseph. They hadn't bothered to really get to know their brother. If they would have really known him and have really studied him and really appreciated his power and his person, they wouldn't have had this fear. Now, if we had the time tonight, I might just ask you, what do you think? Well, let's just take a moment. What do you think? Why did they ask him this question? Is there any other reason why? I'm sorry? Guilty conscience. Sure. Somebody may have said that. I believe their problem was they couldn't forgive themselves. One of the most difficult things for us, folks, is to forgive ourselves. I know people who who've committed wrongs, and they've been with me, and they've come to me. And as much as I pray for them and talk with them and help them through the situation, one of the things that really dogs their mind is they can't forgive themselves. Well, one of the ways, of course, to forgive yourself is to accept the forgiveness of God, to fully embrace the truth of the Word of God, that when God says your sins, once they've been confessed and repented of, they're done. They're buried. They've separated themselves from you as far as the east is from the west. God's buried them in the depths of the ocean. Now, those of you who have been reading along in the book Total Forgiveness by R.T. Kendall, you've probably happened onto the section of the book, How to Forgive Yourself. And if you haven't arrived at that point, read that section. If you want to read even more about that, R.T. Kendall has produced a second book, and I'm not selling his books. I've never met the man. I don't get any royalties, but he has another book called How to Forgive Yourself Totally. It's a separate book altogether. And so if you happen to struggle in that area, I've not read that book, so I can't really vouch for it other than to say I know he wrote it, and I feel pretty confident that it's a pretty solid work. But if that's an area that's a deep struggle for you, that you have a difficult time forgiving yourself when you've done something, you might want to read things like that. Certainly read it in the Total Forgiveness book. I believe their problem was they couldn't forgive themselves. The guilty conscience certainly is a part of it. It was just wearing on them, and all these are all kind of tied together. Well, evidently the broken heart of Joseph, and when he wept, and we've seen several occasions now where Joseph has wept over his brothers and things that they've said. Sometimes it was just emotional crying because of trying to keep things secret for a little while. But now this is real heart-wrenching crying here. But evident that the heartbroken situation of Joseph was the very thing that God used to break these brothers. Look at verse 18. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, "Behold, we are your servants." They see what it did to Joseph. Whether they were clueless to how these words were going to come across. Every now and then we say something to somebody, we ask a question, and we don't mean it at all to come across the way it came across. We didn't mean for the person to take it the way they took it. And maybe that was to give these guys the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they didn't realize how painful these words were going to be. But seeing their brother crying breaks their heart, and they go and they bow down before him one more time. Verse 19, and Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about as it is this day to save many people alive. Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you, for your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Look at verse 20 there. Let's camp there just a minute. "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." What all is included in the it? God meant it for good. I think it includes being hated by his brothers, being rejected and rebuked by his father, being thrown in that pit, sitting down there, having some time to think about wearing this coat of many colors in front of his brothers and how it brought out the worst in these guys. Being sold to the Ishmaelites, the Midianite traders. Being sold to Potiphar, falsely accused of a sexual crime. Boy, don't you know that had to hurt. Here's a young man who has dedicated his life to live for God, a life of purity, a life that he's going to save himself for his future bride, and now he gets accused of a sexual crime. Being thrown in prison, being forgotten by the butler, used of God to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, and then elevated to number 2. I think all that is included in the it. All of those things that God did, and yes, God did, because one of the things we have to embrace in life, folks, either God did it or He allowed it to be done. All this God did to mold a young man who was already dedicated to Him, but to use him in such a way that he'd bring glory and honor to God. He would be a person who could save many people alive, that God knew he could speak a word to this young man and be able then to interpret dreams for a Pharaoh, and Joseph wouldn't take any personal credit. All of this is included in the it. God meant all this, and God did all this. And what you meant, guys, what you meant as evil, God meant it for good. Like Joseph, there's no way we can see what God's doing in our lives at any given moment. When Joseph was thrown into that pit, sitting down there, waiting to die, that really was their plan. Just maybe some wild animal will fall down that hole and just eat him alive, or he'll starve to death. When he's sitting down there, there's no way that he could ever see himself being elevated to number 2 in the nation of Egypt. When he was at 17 years of age, riding in that slave wagon, that smelly, stinky, awful slave wagon, heading down to Egypt, just sold by his brothers, there's no way that one day he'd be able to see himself as the prime minister of the nation. No way. And I don't know what's going on in your life today. I'm sure each of us have something going on. There's no way that we can see what God is doing. But we need to take refuge in the truth that Paul wrote, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to His purpose. It's so easy to say those words when nothing's going on. When everything's great, when the checkbook's fat and the refrigerator's full of food, the car's got a full tank of gas, and the mechanic has just given our car a clean bill of health. But when everything's falling apart, it's hard to say everything works together for good. Joseph, no way he could see all this coming. Verse 21, now therefore do not be afraid. It's like God is speaking to these boys through the mouth of Joseph. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Well, between verses 21 and 22, 54 years pass in a moment. In the white space between verse 21 and 22. How many things were passed over? How many things did Moses not get a chance to write about? 54 years in a space between those two verses. And that takes us to Joseph's burial in point number 4. Joseph's burial. Point, letter A there, Joseph's life. We kind of have a survey of Joseph's life here in verses 22 through 24. Notice verse 22. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. He was 30 years old when he was elevated to prime minister. Now he's 110 years of age. So in this, from the time he was elevated, 80 years passing by. Just those, 54 years just between those two verses. But Joseph lived many years as number 2 in the nation. Look at verse 23. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the 3rd generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. Let's stop there for a minute. Think about Joseph as a grandfather. We've thought about him as this great leader, as this great spokesman for God. Now imagine Joseph as a grandfather, as a great-grandfather, as a great-great-grandfather. He probably took these kids on chariot rides. Probably let them see Egyptian artifacts that nobody else would have been allowed to see. Didn't even imagine existed. Joseph probably had his own Chick-fil-A. And or something like that, and was able to take these kids, maybe had his own Chuck E. Cheese's type place. Sweet tea factory. Yeah, plenty of sweet tea. I had to have that. Probably had his own Dairy Queen, maybe his own Six Flags over Egypt. I think Joseph would have been a tremendous grandfather. Think of the stories he could have told these kids. A great man of God, a great man of faith, just faithful to the end. Let's read on it. Letter B, Joseph's request. Verse 25. Verse 24. We've got to read there first. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Now letter B, Joseph's request, verse 25. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. And then letter C, Joseph's departure. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Think about how they cared for Jacob, and cared for his body. They embalmed him, took 40 days to do all that. However they cared for Jacob, you know they had to care at least as much, if not more, for the body of Joseph. It does tell us here that they put him in a coffin. It's probably there to tell us that not everybody in Egypt was put in a coffin, but he certainly was. Now, in the days of the Egyptians, in the days of Joseph, there would have been two predominant shapes of coffins. One would be the rectangular box like we're familiar with. The other would be, and you've seen this in pictures, where the coffin would be shaped like the body. And they're actually, the coffin is actually prepared especially for the person. And so Joseph would have been embalmed, he would have been mummified, he would have been put in this coffin and prepared and preserved for the Exodus, because even though he spent much, in fact most of his life in Egypt, his idea was, Egypt is not my home. And when you guys leave here, take me with you. That was his message. So he was placed in a coffin. Now you have in your study guide two closing passages. Well, we're going to alter that a little bit. It's actually going to be 4 closing passages. So if you could add a couple of extra circles and underlines there, let me give you some extra verses here just to kind of piece all this together and bring all this to a conclusion. Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 to 8 is the first passage I want to read. Notice what we have here. Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. Notice verse 7, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. But now look at verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now I know it's possible to read too much into a passage, into a verse of Scripture. And I know there were pharaohs that came along that didn't actually ever get a chance to shake Joseph's hand or ever meet him. But how could there be a pharaoh that had at least heard of the lineage of Joseph and the life of Joseph? And some scholars would say that's focusing too much on the wording here. Well, again, I remember the very first time I read this in seminary, and it just really bore down on me, taking a class in the book of Exodus. And that verse has stuck with me. I guess the message for you tonight and the message for me tonight is this. Even if everybody forgets what you do for God, do it for God anyway. Live for God anyway. Live your life for Him. Joseph had no idea they'd forget him or they wouldn't know about him. But evidently there were folks that came along that didn't keep up. They were not history majors. I hated history in high school. I think I despised the book more than I did the study. The book was so thick. I didn't like it from the beginning. But the pharaohs didn't keep up, and so they forgot. Exodus chapter 13, there's our second passage. Exodus 13, verse 17. Then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, Exodus 13, 17. Then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Now verse 18, Exodus 13, 18. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. For he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. Isn't it neat here that the promise and the oath that Joseph got the brothers to commit to, now several hundred years later, they're actually fulfilling the promise and they're carrying Joseph's bones. Go with me to our third passage, Joshua chapter 24. Joshua 24, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. Still in the Old Testament. Joshua 24 and verse 32. Just one verse here. As you're turning there, our Joseph is mentioned 190 times in the Bible. 125 times in the book of Genesis, 65 times in other places in the Bible, and that does not include the Joseph of Joseph and Mary. So our Joseph is mentioned 190 times in the Bible, and these are just a few of the occasions. Verse 32 of Joshua 24. The bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem. That's interesting, isn't it? In the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. And then one more verse, Hebrews 11:22. In our New Testament, at the end of the Pauline writings, Hebrews 11, and you will recognize, many of you will recognize chapter 11 of Hebrews as the great faith chapter. Hebrews 11 and verse 22. Joseph, a great man of faith, a great man of integrity, a great man of honor, faithful to the end. Hebrews 11:22 says, by faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. He said, guys, this is not our home. We're just passing through. And even though I spent much of my life here, don't leave me in Egypt. Take me out of here and bury me at home. Let's pray together, shall we? Just as we pray, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this class. And I pray that God has spoken to you. And again, if you would mind sharing a thought or two on that 3x5 card and turning it in, I'd appreciate it very much. Father, as we come to you right now, I do want to thank you so much for these 7 weeks that we've been able to spend together. Thank you, Father, for the life of Joseph, the life that he lived, the legacy that he leaves behind. Father, may we tonight, even as we close and depart, may we commit our lives afresh and new to you, to live lives of integrity, live lives that are pleasing to you. Not because somebody's going to thank us, not because somebody's going to applaud us or put our name in lights or put our name on a plaque, but simply because you're worthy of a life lived for you. And so I pray, Father, your richest blessings upon each person here. Father, for the one that needs the blessing the most, I pray that double portion on them. Pray, God, that you would just unusually bless them. Father, for the one that's struggling the most tonight, wondering why it is, God, that you're taking them through what you're taking them through. The it in their life, the all things in their life, the load is getting heavy. I pray, Father, that you would just lift them up, remind them that you love us, you never leave us nor forsake us. Bless, Father, as we leave here to move on and live the rest of our lives for your glory. For it is in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. God bless you all. Thanks for being a part of the study.
Thank you so much for such an uplifting future.
Thank you, buddy. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.